Hey everyone, welcome to the Vassals of Kingsgrave, Agatha Christie Reread. We hope you all had a lovely Christmas, Hanukkah, or however you spend the festive season. And we're back with another edition, the 37th episode, and we're covering The Hollow, aka Murder After Hours, which was initially published in November 1946. And for the first time in a long while, we are back with Hercule Poirot. My name is Bina 007. I'll be your host today, and I'm joined by Pat.
Hi there, 2.0 on the Discord.
And the reason why we've decided to do a full episode is that Pat, I think, really enjoyed this, as did All About Agatha, the podcast that we really love. And I did not as much. So maybe this will be a good debate. So Pat, tell us a little bit about how you found The Hollow on first reading.
I enjoyed it. As I said when we were messaging about it on the Discord, I thought you were being a little bit unfair. I do think it's got criticisms that we can get to later on. And I would call it top tier, but depending on how our debate goes on a couple of the points, I would be prepared to drop it a tier. But I think she's drawn her characters as well as any of her better novels. I think in Lady sort of Lucy Angatel, she's got a standout character. I think who sort of merits a lot of attention because she's so entertaining. And I think the social dynamic I sort of mentioned in the last podcast, I quite like these ones that are sort of set somewhere in this sort of aristocratic England of the 20s and 30s, but it's actually been written a bit later because I think it's got this entertaining social dynamic, and I quite enjoy my sort of Jeeves and Wooster social dynamic, and this has got it. So it ticks boxes for me. I think also as well what recommends this over some other Christies, I think in John Christow, we've got one of Agatha's more interesting men.
Yes.
He is quite a complicated character.
And based on someone she knew in real life, which maybe is why, because it wasn't as much of an imaginative feat.
Yeah.
I have to say, I agree with you. I think the characters are phenomenal in this book. And that is even including for the fact that the opening page of this novel reader, if you want to know what I'm like with my constant train of internal monologue aimed at whoever is in proximity halfway through the conversation, is a little bit Lady Angatel. It is a little bit flaky in real life. So even despite the fact that I felt seen and heard by a character which was not flattering, I still think the characterization is really, really good. And I also like the fact that although it is country house and it is very 20s, it's more knowingly so. There's a lot in the novel about how Lady Angatel is trying to imitate the country house of her childhood. So the fact that it feels anachronistic when it's written in 1946 and it feels a bit more like a 20s Jeeves and Wooster with Gudgeon the butler, I think is very knowing, and maybe we'll come back to that when we get to Bertram's Hotel. So I think that to me is much more successful. Where this falls down for me is in the plot mechanics. So we'll have to, unfortunately, listener, get to that in the spoiler section of this podcast. So as always, we're going to be spoiler free as we go through, the context of the times, the characters, adaptations, whether it holds up to modern readers. And then when we get to the end credits music after that, we can maybe get into why I find this ultimately quite a frustrating book. Despite the fact that I agree with you, Pat, I think these are some of the best characters that we've seen, maybe apart from Five Little Pigs, Sad Cypress. I mean, there are other books with great characters, but I think this is a really phenomenal collection of characters, and that's why people love this book, right? Okay, so let's maybe do a little introduction. So the novel is indeed a country house mystery of the type that I think that people often think Agatha Christie only wrote. So it's set with sort of minor aristos
playing into the stereotype here.
Absolutely. And then we have Hercule Poirot, who's rented a little cottage nearby, but is altogether uncomfortable in the country and in this sort of rustic cottage, and probably is quite excited to be given the tableau of a murder, which he immediately recognizes as being almost stagey in its simplicity. And the big sort of mysteries at the heart of this novel, the one that Agatha Christie says of the novel itself, is what would a woman look like who had just shot her husband? And that's what Hercule Poirot is posed with as well. So he basically walks down to a swimming pool and is met with the body of John Christow, an eminent doctor and research doctor, and his wife Gerda is standing over him with a gun, apparently having just shot him, and other members of the family, the Angatel family, are coming in to surround. They're all cousins in various ways and forms. So it's kind of a closed house mystery, not quite, because there are some characters who aren't living in the house or part of the family. But the idea is it feels so apparent that the wife has just shot her husband, and she has motive because he's serially cheating on her. But did she really do it? Can it really just be as simple as, yeah, the wife did it? So that's the kind of the setup of the book. Right, let's get into the historical context of the book and maybe some of the social change that we see. I mean, again, this is a little bit of a weird one, right? Because it's written or published just after World War II. But again, there's not much mention of World War II. But there is some social change in here. People are motoring to the suburbs for country house weekends. We have women who have degrees, university degrees. We have Midge's father. So Midge is one of the poorer Angatel cousins. And we get a mention of the fact that her father's business is slowly dying. And it's made, I think we're meant to understand that he hasn't kept up with new technological and industrial change. And so one of the old types who are now coming a cropper. We have mention of a Kona coffee maker. And if you go to Kona, so Kona.co.uk, this coffee maker that Agatha Christie is mentioning is very cool looking. It's like two glass things with a glass burner underneath. Very cool. And that was only created in the year of publication. So she would have been right up to date with her mention of this.
Oh my God, it's a paid endorsement. I don't believe it. Agatha's already leveraging the marketing revenue of product placement in her novels. Incredible.
I wonder if Agatha Christie was much more Hercule Poirot, because we know that she loved her indoor heating, her central heating. She didn't like drafty country. I mean, she loved her country house of her childhood, and she lived in successive country houses. But she also has this part of her that's very modernistic. If you look at the building that she lived in London, the Isicon building, that was incredibly avant-garde and modern at the time, and very sort of Hercule Poirot, rational square lines. And I don't know. It just tickles me to think of this now 56-year-old woman mentioning this like cutting edge hipster, like coffee making method that you think of as sort of shortcut hipsters using these days.
I think she definitely embraced the new technologies as they came along. And I think it was something that she was obviously interested in. I mean, you only have to see that when she's like writing her novels about flying and things like that. And all the travel. It's like she goes through these phases, don't you? And you see the technology get mentioned, and it is at the cusp of its public sort of introduction, and she's like right there at the forefront. And I think, yes, you're probably right. Having like when you're sitting down here thinking about this, romantically imagining Agatha embracing all these new technologies, and if she was around like 20 years ago, I'm sure she would have had one of the first iPhones, and that would have been in her novel as well. She would have been.
Yeah. I think if her was being Stephen Fry, like she would have had one of those massive Macs, and would have been one of the first to be aggressively on Twitter. But it's great at her age, and I guess she had the money to sort of have all the latest fads too. Yeah. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting, and we're going to see more of this in other books that are forthcoming, is the idea of India being a big topic in England at the time, because this was published in November 46, by the next summer, India achieves independence from the British Empire, like the jewel in the crown, to use the phrase. And John Christow is an Anglo-Indian. And it's the first mention we've had to date of a half Indian character in this case.
Is he actually half Indian? I never picked up on that. I know that he is the son of people who are British citizens who are living and working in India, and so he's been farmed out to relatives in England and spent a lot of his time being brought up in boarding school. But I'd never picked up that he was like sort of like half Indian and half.
If you use the phrase Anglo-Indian with a capital A, capital I, and specifically at the time, I think that does imply that either your parents directly or some of your ancestors, probably some guy who went out with the empire in the 1860s, got together with an Indian woman. So, but the key thing about Anglo-Indians is a lot of them pass, to use that horrible phrase, as white. And they were put in a particularly strange predicament when independence was being discussed, because what was going to be their standing in an independent India, because they were mostly speaking English as a first language. They were typically raised as Christians. They were wearing very Western clothes. They were culturally very, very British. And a lot of Anglo-Indians in the run-up to independence did leave India because they weren't sure of what their standing would be. I just found that really fascinating, that it's the first time in Agatha Christie that I've seen the phrase Anglo-Indian. And maybe I'm hypersensitive to it because there was, every now and then, Netflix will fund a big budget Indian Bollywood film. And the latest one that it funded that came on very recently was called The Archies, which is weirdly a remake of an American comic book that then became Riverdale. But apparently this was like hugely popular in India of like the 60s and 70s. But they've remade it, and the person who's remade it has set it entirely in the Anglo-Indian community and explains what happened to them in the wake of independence, those that chose to stay behind. So maybe I'm highly sensitized to it. If anyone has a view on this listening, and knows whether John Christow is indeed an Anglo-Indian in the definition that I'm using versus just someone who was a child born in the Raj and then shipped home for boarding school, do make a comment on the YouTube channel or join us on the Discord and let us know, because to me this was really interesting, and you're going to get a lot of this in forthcoming books. And I think it's an interesting reflection of the fact that in, dinner parties in England at the time, I'm sure people would have been discussing what happens with independence and is this the end of the British Empire? And, this would have been post-war one of the biggest issues to hit England, and a really negative one in a way, like the end of huge.
Well, I mean, again, I suppose it's got sort of echoes of a more recent question we had with the lease being up on Hong Kong, and that having to be handed back, and the whole issue of Hong Kong citizenship.
Yeah.
Which again is very interesting. Like, you have these people who are effectively just cut off from Britain. You're like, okay, we're just going to, they don't have any rights. We're just going to surrender them. So it is, it's interesting. That's sort of like post-colonial issues that need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And I think if for those of you who watched the latest BBC adaptation of Murder is Easy, where they transpose it from the mid-30s to the mid-50s, they really situate that in a sort of a decolonizing British Empire, and I think in a really superb way. So just something to reflect on there too. But, in the timeline of this book, since the last one was published in December 45, and this is November 46. Actually, we're still kind of in the fallout of the World War II period as far as big events go. And you'll all be relieved to know that there's less history to get through, partly because it's a shorter gap between novels and partly because we're not in the war years. So January 46 is the first meeting of the United Nations, held, I didn't know this, in the Methodist Central Hall in Westminster in London. I always think of it in New York, but no, it was in Westminster. In February 46, ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, an early general-purpose electronic computer, is unveiled at the University of Pennsylvania. It weighs over 27 tons and occupies a big room. Perón is elected in Argentina, and Peronists still exist in Argentina, and it's still a major political movement. In March 1946, Ho Chi Minh is elected president of North Vietnam. And in his speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill talks about the Iron Curtain. So that's where that phrase comes from, March 46. In April 46, in Japan, women vote for the first time. Trials against the war criminals begins in Tokyo. The accused include Hideki Tojo, Shigenori Togo, and Hiroshi Oshima. So again, it's the reckoning of World War II. And in May 46, the Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Company is founded, later renamed Sony, or Sony, I think you're meant to pronounce it, with about 20 employees. So all the kind of dealing with what happened to Japan in the war, but also reconstructing it along more modern democratic lines are occurring. In June 1946, Italy becomes a republic. In July 46, the bikini is first modeled in Paris. At Club 500 in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis staged their first show as a comedy team. And I love Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, so that's great. August 1946, Santa Claus Land opens to the public at Santa Claus, Indiana. I can't believe there's a place called Santa Claus, Indiana. It becomes the first ever theme park, preceding Disneyland by 9 years, and is later renamed Holiday World.
Yeah, and the Finns are still put out about that today, because they believe Santa Claus is firmly theirs. So
there you go. They need to have a class action lawsuit and sue. In September 1946, the Turin Grand Prix is the first ever official Formula One Grand Prix, and it's held in Italy, obviously. And October 1946, so just before publication of this book, France adopted the Constitution of the Fourth Republic, so again, reconstructing after the war along new lines, and again, reckoning for World War II. The Nuremberg trials are ongoing. Hermann Goering, founder of the Gestapo and recently convicted Nazi war criminal, poisons himself 2 hours before his scheduled execution. So yes, we're still, I feel like when you look at the historic context, it's all very much about what is society going to look like after World War II. And for the defeated countries, that's often sort of radical constitutional change. But when we get to the next novel, which is Taken at the Flood, you'll see a lot of what that post-World War II social context was in England, and no less change in some ways, societal change, economic change, bringing in a landslide Labour government, massive political change. So we'll get into that domestically in the next novel. But yeah, with the inclusion of an Anglo-Indian character, I feel that you're seeing a little bit the decolonization theme that's going to run through the next couple of decades too. Any thoughts on the historic context? Less of it this time.
Yeah, there's a lot of very important stuff in there.
Let's get into the characters of this novel. So we'll start off with the detective, because he's back after an incredibly long gap, much to the publisher's chagrin, Monsieur Hercule Poirot.
And the readers' chagrin. You've been missed, Hercule. It's great to have you back.
It is great to have him back. Do you have any particular Hercule Poirotisms? The Xander, aka Lord Baron, sort of memorial part of the podcast. Any particular good Poirot moments for you?
No, I think this book again is quite lean on it. I enjoyed reading him. What I took out of this one, though, is Poirot seems to have become the go-to shoulder to cry on for all the ladies at the mansion.
Yes.
So he receives a bevy of beautiful ladies who visit him, after the murder, to have a heart-to-heart with him about John Christow and his death. So I thought that was quite interesting that they've pegged him as somebody that they can talk to privately. Yeah, and they all come in and say, "I can trust your discretion, Mr. Poirot, if I tell you this, can't I?" So I thought that was maybe the most noteworthy thing. So for me,
I agree. If you want to get into the vanity and particularity of Poirot, there was one little passage that stuck out to me for Xander. Hercule Poirot flicked a last speck of dust from his shoes. He had dressed carefully for his luncheon party, and he was satisfied with the result. He knew well enough the kind of clothes that were worn in the country on a Sunday in England, but he did not choose to conform to English ideas. He preferred his own standards of urban smartness. He was not an English country gentleman. He was Hercule Poirot! Exclamation mark.
Fantastic.
He makes his own rules, sartorial and otherwise.
Yeah, he's immune to peer pressure.
Indeed. Okay, so let's get into the next character, I think murder victim and wife, and then we'll get into the family that they're staying with in the country. So Dr. John... Oh, sorry.
We've got to address the two detectives as well, because, okay, I know they're only minor characters.
Oh, you go for it then.
Inspector Grange is presented as somebody who is easily confused and baffled and just a little bit stupid. And I loved the introduction of Sergeant Clark, who is a good-looking honey trap sent in to, get information out of the servants.
But that's not the first time, right, is it? I think in Cards on the Table and maybe ABC Murders, we had younger, good-looking policemen who were sent in to charm, in particular, the working-class ladies, right? He could get round the sort of the maid servants and get gossip.
What I thought was worth mentioning is, I don't know if you've seen See How They Run, which was sort of like a Christie homage.
Yes.
Well, they've got the same character in that. They've got like a good-looking police sergeant who's sent in to charm, some of the sort of the workers in the cinema at the time to get the backstory. And I just thought it's interesting because obviously Christie's probably one of the first people to use this sort of idea of the good-looking policeman being sent in to chat up the staff.
By
but
any means
even now,
necessary.
They're still using it. So
absolutely cool. Okay, so let's get into Dr. John Christow. As you said, a Harley Street doctor, and when we meet him, he comes across as incredibly charming and urbane and so wonderful with the ladies, his patients. But actually, we realize from his internal monologue or from the third person writing that he hates it. He absolutely hates all these pampered hypochondriac women, and he only does this so that he can fund his research work, where he's trying to cure an obscure disease called Ridgway's disease. And he feels very alive when he's in the hospital, and he has this amazing, wonderful patient who he admires for being so full of life and so full of a willingness to fight the disease. So that's his intellectual life is really where he's most alive. We know he's been serially unfaithful, and he's married a rather sort of plain, dutiful wife. But he's a fascinating character. I think you're absolutely right. This is the sentence, or the couple of sentences I thought that were just wonderful. Hard, unremitting drudgery and few pleasures, but she wanted to live. She enjoyed life, just as he, John Christow, enjoyed life. It wasn't the circumstances of life they enjoyed, it was life itself, the zest of existence. So that's basically John Christow describing his poor patient in the hospital who may well die of her disease. But I think he does come across as, we only see him for a very short time because then he's murdered, but he does feel this like very sort of charismatic, powerful, magnetic character.
And I think Christie, I don't think Christie is trying to emphasize that to us, because as he's dying, Poirot makes that statement, doesn't he? I was there amongst all these people by the side of the pool, and yet the man who was dying was the one who was most full of life. He was the most engaging person there, even though he was about to die. So, Christie's constantly trying to emphasize to us that we should see him as a charismatic character, and take this opportunity. But what I found fascinating, and I was actually found it frustrating as I was going through it, was his relentless double standards. I think he was a man who didn't really understand himself. He was very, I don't know what you would say, very instinctive in what he wanted. So he has this very passionate affair at a young age with this famous actress. And he decides that because she wants to pursue a career and wants him to follow her, and he wants to have his own career separately, that he's just going to cut off all ties with her. So, and then he deliberately marries somebody who's the complete opposite. And then he finds that he is completely frustrated in that marriage because she isn't intellectually challenging him. But then when he meets a woman who does intellectually challenge him, he wants her to be just as submissive as his wife. And it's like he's never happy, And I think he is somebody who's almost seeking to be challenged in his life. And I think that's part of what Christie's got across so well in this portrayal of him, as almost like this, to use the cliche, an alpha male character. He is somebody who needs to be challenged all the time, even though he wants to be on top. He still needs to be stretched and pushed.
And it's a recipe for a very frustrating life, as you say. He reminds me, when I was reading him, of there's a brilliant Irving Berlin song that was used with great comic effect in Boardwalk Empire called "After You Get What You Want, You Don't Want It." And the lyrics are, if I gave you the moon, you'd grow tired of it soon. You're like a baby, you want what you want when you want it. But after you're presented what you want, you grow discontented. And it's basically that the whole song is like exactly what you said, that he wants someone exciting and challenging and independent, but he immediately wants to turn them into a worshipper.
He wants to conquer them almost. He feels the need. Yeah. But
I'm not even sure if it's misogynistic, it's just narcissistic. He knows he's clever and he knows his work's important. He probably will cure this disease, right, if he lives. And it in a way, it's kind of just like brutally utilitarian. Like my happiness and work is more important than yours.
I do think that's one of the ways that Agatha's conveyed how charismatic he is. And I think that's probably coming back to what you were saying at the start, where it's based on somebody who she knew in her real life. He'd almost recognized this contradictory element of a successful person's nature. Part of what drives them is their desire to conquer everything and their frustration when they've conquered it. It's like that quote about Alexander the Great. He wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. It's like you're never satisfied. So I think she's done that quite well with this character. And like I said, I think apart from Poirot, he's probably one of the most interesting male characters, if not the most interesting male character that I've read in a Poirot. So.
I agree, and certainly the only one in this novel for sure. So he has met and married Gerda Christow. Rather plain, gives the impression of being clumsy. She worries about everything. She idealizes John, blames herself for her problems, even when it's he who is wrong, and inspires a sculpture by Henrietta called The Worshipper, which is described as being frightening as it has no face. This is Lucy Angertel talking about her. It really does make things difficult. And the worst of it is that she's so nice. really it seems odd sometimes that anyone so nice as Gerda should be so devoid of any kind of intelligence. And if that is what they mean by the law of compensation, I don't really think that it's at all fair. And then there's a second quotation where John first sees the sculpture of his wife called the Worshipper. John looked at it unwillingly. For the first time, his anger and resentment became subordinated to his interest. A strange submissive figure, a figure offering up worship to an unseen deity, the face raised, blind, dumb, devoted, terribly strong, terribly fanatical. Thoughts on Gerda Christow in a non-spoiler way?
This was the sort of aspect of John Christow that made me quite angry, because I feel that he'd almost emotionally bulldozed her. I found it like very uncomfortable to read that passage at the start about the mutton, where
Yes.
you're like listening to her internal monologue of the self-doubt, and she is paralyzed by fear. And it's almost like any decision she made, rather than doing nothing, would have been the right one. But she is so paralyzed by making the wrong decision, she does nothing. And in the end, she just opens herself up to criticism. And like you listen to him come in and say, oh my God, this mutton is cold. Why haven't you sent it back down? And you're thinking, like, you're the one to blame here. Will you just stop gaslighting her? It's, it is, we can talk about it later on. We get like more of her internal monologues, and she does have a bit more depth. And I think this is a theme that Agatha has in quite a few of her novels, where like you get these very placid characters, but you realize that they've got depths to them. They're superficially quite calm, but they have got depths.
And she draws these characters time and again. She's done it a lot with young girls recently. So young daughter in Evil Under the Sun, not actually that young daughter who's a bit abandoned, was actually a young woman in The Moving Finger. She often has these women that are sort of seen as kind of quite pitiable and pathetic, but, they're just fine. But it's, they've been beaten down by others. And you're right. The Gerda character just does feel like, her husband's not beating her, but she does feel like a victim of spousal abuse, because he's done such a number on her self-confidence. She's literally paralyzed with fear over what she should do with lunch. It's crazy.
Yeah. It is. I find that an uncomfortable passage to read, and I think Agatha's written it that way deliberately. So
I agree. Okay, we'll probably get more into it at the end, but let's get into two of the women that John Christow has been having affairs with. The first, and as you said, the sort of the original love or not love of his life, was Veronica Cray, who has now gone on to become a very famous movie actress. She is very beautiful. She's very narcissistic, equally narcissistic as John Christow. She wanted Christow to abandon his early career and follow her to Hollywood. He rejected her. They've both gone on to some success. She has now come back to England and has taken up a cottage next to the country house where they're all going to be staying, and on the pretext of not having enough matches or needing to borrow matches from her neighbours, crashes a dinner party, basically to create an opportunity to see John Christow again and hopefully rekindle that early romance.
I think you've summed her up quite well. I think where I would say she would tie in as a character would be a reflection on how social attitudes have changed. Because I think that she was written intentionally as a very negative character, because she desired to have this career independently of John Christow and expected John Christow to follow her when she pursued her career in Hollywood. They make a great deal about how egotistical she is. And you're sort of looking at it now and going, what's really wrong with a woman wanting to be successful? Whereas back then, the fact that she wanted to subordinate her boyfriend at the time, her fiance at the time, is almost presented as a valid reason why John Christow should end the relationship. And I'm like, I'm not sure that holds up as well now in the 21st century. So it's just an example of the sort of the changing social attattitues. Really.
I think probably says more about, and also says a lot about both of their narcissism on both parts. Because I was thinking a lot about Agatha Christie, like this incredibly successful woman in her own right, and yet she didn't demand her husband give up his archaeological career or vice versa. She would go to digs that he was on and support him there, and he presumably was very pleased to support her in her work as well, and it seemed to work rather well. In sharp contrast to the first marriage, where I think Archie Christie did have some issue with her being the breadwinner. But in a sense, maybe this
Yeah.
is sort
Well,
of.
we have seen this theme before in previous
Mm,
Christies. So we had this in Death on the Nile, didn't we? Where
yeah,
you have the man resenting being subordinate to the more successful wife.
yeah.
It's felt that you can't have two strong people in a relationship. One has to be weak and the other one has to be strong. I mean, I think we saw it again with Appointment with Death, didn't we? Our
Yes.
bright young thing in there, the doctor. She decides that her last relationship didn't last because they both wanted to be successful professionals, and she needed somebody who was going to be a bit more subordinate to her because you couldn't have two strong characters in a relationship. So it's something, and I do feel maybe it's not as much of a reflection on Christie for all the problems that we have with her because of the time she was writing in, but is a reflection of the problems that we have with the time that she was writing in and how social attitudes have changed.
Yeah, I agree. But it is interesting, and I think part of what makes this book so compelling is we have not one, not two, but three people who really put their careers first. So we've got John Christow, who's been very single-minded. Veronica Cray, equally single-minded and successful, good for her. But we also have Henrietta Savanaake, who is one of the many Angatel cousins that we're going to get into. And she is the current person that John Christow is having an affair with. And it's implied that maybe this is more than a fling. She is a sculptor, a cousin of Sir Henry Angatel. She is kind. I mean, she's kind to Gerda when she sees Gerda feels left out or awkward. She really goes out of her way to make her feel included and special.
Do you think that is out of pity?
No, I don't. Well, let's get into that, and I think we'll have to get into that in the spoilerful section probably.
Okay, all right.
But she's also unscrupulous, and she loves her work. She loves her art. There's a wonderful kind of passage where she talks about the act of creation and how things seep into them, and you can't sort of keep them out. Maybe this is how Agatha felt. Queer, thought Henrietta, how things can seep into you without your knowing it. She hadn't been listening, not really listening, and yet knowledge of Doris's cheap, spiteful little mind had seeped into her mind and had unconsciously influenced her hands. So the prattle of the person she's modelling in clay has influenced the sculpture.
And I thought what was fantastic about that was the way that at the start of that whole passage, she's said, I've been looking for this perfect blank stare in a beautiful face so that I can create this model of this mythological character, this blind servant girl, who encompassed all this. And she sees it on the street and goes, this person captures it perfectly. And then she tells herself while all this is going on, I'm not being affected by this. I'm able to just reflect back to her the conversation while I get on with my work. And then at the end of it, she's happy with it all and she's got it all. And then she finds after like a day or a few hours that she can't anymore. The woman has actually worn her down with all the prattling, and she destroys the work of art because. And it was great just seeing that that sort of tortured artist element. I think it's tying into what you were saying about, was this just part of what Agatha felt as an artist herself? Yeah. The dedication that she's got in this book is to a couple of friends that she had. Let me just pull it up. For Larry and Dana, with apologies for using their swimming pool as the scene of a murder. And I think like the Larry in the dedication, he says, I know exactly when she started writing it because we have a crossroads exactly the same as they have in the book with several paths. And she was staying with us for a weekend and I saw her standing at the center of the crossroads. And she was like, well, what if all the characters all came up the different paths at the same time and stood in this scene? And she said, and she spent the rest of the weekend walking up and down all the different paths that we have to it. And you just see, like, it's almost like, there you go, that's the artist. She's got the idea. And her daughter, Rosalind, found that this was one of her favorites. And it was because she felt she got an explanation of why Agatha got so wrapped up in writing, and maybe didn't spend as much time with her teenage daughter in her formative years as the teenage daughter would have liked. So.
And there's a wonderful passage, often with Agatha Christie books, and particularly Hercule Poirot, he kind of announces who did it, and then the book very kind of abruptly ends. I mean, I remember reading Murder on the Orient Express for the first time, thinking there's literally like 3 sentences after the explanation, and it's over. Like, what? Whereas this book has quite a long, almost epilogue or coda. And really what that epilogue is about the value of work. And for people who are obsessed with their work, how very little can distract them from it. And it comes from the perspective of Henrietta, who is the artist here, the sculptress. And I really feel that is Agatha speaking for herself. And at some point, she's almost apologizing for sculpting what has just happened, because that's the only way she can process it. But almost it's more that I am an artist. This is what I do. And although this might seem exploitative, I cannot be other than as what I am. And I think that's probably Agatha sort of apologizing to people in her life, saying, like, I know that I've used bits and bobs of all of you, but this is what I do and I can't do anything else. Like, it's literally a compulsion.
Yeah. I'm tortured when the muse is upon me. This is what I must do. So, yeah.
And it's interesting because not in this book, but obviously we mentioned in the last podcast that Rosalind's husband had just been shot down and killed in the Battle of Normandy. And in the following book and books thereafter, when she really does go through the impact of World War II, we are going to see again and again people who are young pilots who are dead, young, specifically Royal Air Force men who have died. And I wonder if it's almost like a foreshadowing where Agatha's like, I'm really sorry, Rosalind, and to all of you reading this, but this happened and I have to talk about this now. I'm going to have to write about this because things seep into me, and the only way I can move forward is to kind of write through them. So I really love the book. I think this is as close as we get to Agatha talking about what it is to have that compulsion of artistic genius.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's there. I think we see it in there. It's a character, and I think, like, just to go off on a tangent, I would say that's one of the reasons why I would include this book in top tier, is because in, like, some of the books that Agatha's written that I've really enjoyed reading and I thought have been good, she doesn't always stick the landing gracefully. So like for Sad Cypress, she just like wraps it up. Oh, don't worry, dear, we'll book you into a sanatorium and everything will be fine. And you're like, it's not really as graceful an ending as I would have liked to have seen. And in others, like Appointment with Death, we have like that full chapter at the ballet at the end, and you're like, what is all this waffle about?
Wait till you get to Taken at Flood. That's got a horrible final ending, as I pointed out.
But she does it well in this one. So
yeah,
I think
it's brilliant. Okay, well, let's get into the Angertel family, of whom Henrietta is a part. And the country house at which they're all staying is not, in fact, Ainswick, which is the beloved family seat. The owner of the Hollow is Sir Henry Angertel. He has married his distant cousin Lucy. I don't think I really have much to say about Sir Henry other than that he conveniently owns a whole bunch of guns.
Yes. I think the one thing I think is worth mentioning is that he is a former diplomat.
Yes.
Because they do talk a bit about this, about the diplomatic angle. And I want to discuss that in relation to his wife, Lucy.
The charming Lucy Angertel, who she is Lucy Lady Angertel, sociable, charismatic. She has a very sort of flaky, ditzy sort of persona. But in a sense, this allows her to get away with everything. She can charm the birds from the trees, apparently. She also, apparently, is just like me. So this is what I want to read out. Since she was a woman of disconcertingly rapid thought processes, Lady Angertel, as was her invariable custom, commenced the conversation in her own mind, supplying Midge's answers out of her own fertile imagination. The conversation was in full swing when Lady Angertel flung open Midge's door. And so, darling, you really must agree that the weekend is going to present difficulties. What? Midge grunted inarticulately, aroused thus abruptly from a satisfying and deep sleep. To me, this feels like Agatha knew this character. I mean, it's so true to life. But well, anyway,
go on.
This is the passage that really is important because it's how Lucy operates and how we will see her operating in the novel. Yet even as she voiced the thought to herself, she was aware of the answer. Lucy Angertel was smiling, and as Midge looked at her, she felt the extraordinary pervasive charm that Lucy had wielded all her life, and that even now, at over 60, had not failed her. Because of it, people all over the world, foreign potentates, ADCs, government officials, had endured inconvenience, annoyance, and bewilderment. It was the childlike pleasure and delight in her own doings that disarmed and nullified criticism. Lucy had but to open those wide blue eyes and stretch out those fragile hands and murmur, "Oh, but I'm so sorry," and resentment immediately vanished. And that's just kind of, that is its own kind of narcissism, right? Like this idea that the world will bend to your wishes just if you lay on enough creamy ditzy charm.
And maybe I'm reading too much into this character, But I was struck when I was reading it. I can't remember which biography I was reading, but it was somebody who'd been a diplomat, and they said, like, when you're a diplomat, you have to have an excellent line in small talk, because you will spend several hours a day dealing with very serious issues, but you still have to meet these people socially and try and engage with them socially. So you'll often around the dinner table end up discussing things like, what's your favorite end of the bathtub when you're in the bath? And you need to have that almost surreal ability to lapse into these trivial conversations, but still be effortlessly charming. And I got the feeling that the reason that Sir Henry was probably quite a successful diplomat is because his wife has got that gear. She is able, because she's so intelligent and charming and charismatic, to have these conversations with people where she is, 2 or 3 steps ahead of them conversationally, and they're playing catch up, and they only realize what they're actually, where the conversation is going when it's too late. They're already there discussing it. I found she was a fascinating character. They mentioned in the All About Agatha podcast that she reminds them of Lady Bracknell, and I'd stick her in this group of fascinating older women that Agatha's written. I mean, we were talking about the lady in Towards Zero as well as being somebody who says what she likes and likes what she says, and like, this is it. She's written another great dame of English literature.
I agree.
Who should be up there
too, with all her international travel. She's 56 at the time of publication. Lucy Angatel's just over 60, and yeah, maybe this is a little bit Agatha too. I think she's probably one of my top 5 favorite characters in Agatha Christie. Lucy Angatel.
Yeah, certainly. Who hasn't got like the title detective or a novel based around them? Definitely.
Yeah. I didn't realize that sounded really narcissistic too, because I just said she's a bit like me.
Yeah. Well, it's your podcast, Bina. If you can't be narcissistic here, where can you be?
Everyone's narcissistic so far, right? So John Christow is, well, not Gerda, but John is, Henrietta is, Veronica certainly is, and I would argue that Lucy Angatel kind of is.
Well, what I would say is the only people who find other people interesting are all narcissists. The one person who doesn't seem to be a narcissist, Gerda, is the one that everybody looks down on.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got Henry and Lucy Angatel who own the house, and then of their many cousins, one is Henrietta, who we've already discussed. We then have Edward Angatel, who is a distant cousin of Henry and the person who inherited the family's beloved house Ainswick, where they all grew up spending summer holidays, and Lucy Angatel grew up there. He's seen as, I think, quite a bookish guy. He's happy just sort of pottering around his country house, reading books, seems rather shy, very overshadowed by John Christow. He has been in love with Henrietta for many years, I think asked her to marry him 3 or 4 times, and she turned him down and is obviously now having an affair with John Christow. So he very much is the spurned lover. And he owns this amazing, massive country house. And maybe we can pair him with Midge Hardcastle, who is another of the cousins, but comes from one of the impoverished lines of the family and actually has to work a job in a shop. She's a shop sales assistant, and she has to deal with unpleasant women being unpleasant to her. And all the family pity her, and, Edward will say very kind of naive things to her, like, "Why? How can you stick it? Why do you put up with this job?" And she loses her rag with him and says, "Because I've got to earn money, you foolish people." And so I rather like Midge because she refuses financial aid from this family, and she takes pride in the fact that no, she's going to face reality and work in this shop. So eventually, I think Edward rather admires her and sort of feels maybe they could be an item. But they're an interesting contrast. There's the old money and the kind of romantic old money and the new reality of post-war Britain where you've got to get a bloody job.
And Agatha's written this Edward Angatel character before. We saw him as the elder brother in 5 Little Pigs. He is very much this...
romantic.
The landed gentry, but on the wane. Taxes are beginning to bite. Land isn't as profitable as it used to be. But they're quite happy with that. They will just live off the income that they gather from their estate. They're not going to try and innovate in any way to try and change things up. And unlike 5 Little Pigs, I don't think this is represented too negatively. It's just stated as a fact. This is it. He's quite comfortable.
What it is. But I think there's real admiration for Midge. And then the final Angatel is David Angatel, who was a student, also bookish, but in a much more ideological way. rather antisocial, rather contemptuous of the other Angatels, probably thinks he's rather superior to them intellectually and politically.
He is the perfect revolutionary, isn't he? Because he's disenfranchised and overeducated. So he is just spoiling to start a revolution.
Absolutely. The book quote I have for him is, David had come to the Hollow in a spirit of considerable unwillingness. Until now, he had never met either Sir Henry or Lady Angatel, and disapproving of the Empire, capital E generally, he was prepared to disapprove of these relatives of his. Edward, whom he did not know, he despised as a dilettante. The remaining 4 guests he examined with a critical eye. Relations, he thought, were pretty awful, and one was expected to talk to people, a thing which he hated doing. Which, frankly, I think is interesting on 2 parts. Number one, because he mentions the Empire, and as I say, I think we are going into a sort of decolonization period, and that will become more of an issue along with the war impact. And secondly, because for many people at Christmas, they will express the same view of having to talk to relations who they think are pretty awful. So
Brilliant.
It's appropriate for the time of the year. The final character is Gudgeon the butler. Very protective of Lady Angatel, a comedy butler straight out of Jeeves and Wooster.
There's a few instances where Lady Angatel describes him as feudal, which I thought has nailed the idea of this butler and the Jeeves character from Jeeves and Wooster down pat. I mean, Bertie Wooster always describes Jeeves as feudal as well. And I think what's interesting about that is the way that phrase just captures the concept that the butler's first and only duty was to the household. Like, they were prepared to break the law. I mean, they do it in quite a trivial way in Jeeves and Wooster. You know, like Jeeves will help Bertie get round paying his £5 fine to the courts and things like that. But in this, you know, you see Gudgeon will start shifting guns about, you know, at the behest of Lady Angatel. So, like, they are, you know, devoted to the household. And that, it's quite dark later on, but it's initially, we're introduced in quite a comical way. It just follows on from this passage where you were talking about Lady Angatel just bursting in on Midge at like 6 a.m, you know, to announce her idea. And she decides that she's going to make Midge a cup of tea because it's a perfect time for a cup of tea. So she puts the kettle on. But then she gets quite tired and goes to bed. And then we get that great aside down in the kitchen where Gudgeon comes in and the cook goes, "Oh, I see you've burnt out another kettle, Gudgeon." And he goes, "Yes, don't worry, I've replaced it, you know, so Lady Angatel won't know any different." And the cook's going, "How many is that we've gone through?" And he says something like, "Oh, it's 6 this month, but don't worry, we keep a good stock of them, so her ladyship's never bothered about the kettles being wasted." And you like, it's a great comic scene, but you see the devotion that the butler has to the family, you know, just presented quite concisely. So I like Gudgeon as a character.
I love Gudgeon as a character, and he's very much the double act with Lucy, and they're just phenomenal, really interesting. Okay, so let's maybe get into what has and hasn't held up well to the modern reader before getting into the adaptations. So what do we have in this novel? We have the colour question, interesting. And that's what I said. I think this is the first novel where I'm really, since the sort of early 1920s South African set novels, where we're really dealing with empire and the colour question. So this is a quote. This is Midge thinking about Lucy. "She's put deadly enemies next to each other at the dinner table and run riot over the colour question." So I do think there's an element at which, I don't know, suddenly we're seeing race not as this kind of weird one-liner note of anti-Semitism or mention of the Negro or whatever, but it's seeping into things a bit more. Maybe I'm overreading into that.
I don't think you are, and like we'll get on to others that we come later on, and I do think. I think this is the book that is most severely criticised for its regressive commentary. I think they mark it down by 3 points.
Really?
And
that feels better.
Well, no, I think it's quite fair. I think one of the points that they make is the bit where we get onto when we're talking about the shopkeeper.
Oh, the anti-Semitism,
because of the context of what will have come out. I mean, you've made this point in earlier podcasts as well. Like, Agatha was aware of German attitudes towards the Jews. Like, she'd been speaking to people pre-war who were members of the Nazi party. It's mentioned in her diaries, you know. So to still have this
I see. Context-related marking, because there's definitely
Yeah.
far worse anti-Semitism in earlier books. But it is shocking to see it when we've just had these like long historic context sections of like the past or 4 or 5 podcasts listing
particularly
events of the Holocaust, and you think, really?
Yeah, we've just had the liberation of a lot of these concentration camps, so this will
Mm,
have been front and center, and I
yeah.
think they were saying like they think that this is sort of like a turning point, because you see this Jewish reference a lot less. In fact, I think this might be the last one that they
I hope
say,
so.
because they say that the American publishers now saying like, you can't have this in anymore. This is just, it's not acceptable. So it ties back to that, and then there were none, and the book title in there, and how it had to be changed for the American audience. Anyway,
It's really
we can start
disappointing.
talking about.
It is really disappointing that it's the external thing of the publishers telling her that for commercial reasons, not her coming to the own conclusion. So for the reader, if you haven't read it yet, there is Midge, who works for a shopkeeper, and unfortunately, we're getting back to really 1920s Agatha, where commercially savvy people are typically Jewish, and they're marked by being harsh. I'm thinking of the hairdresser in which book is it? Where someone is it the Murder in the Clouds, Death in the Clouds, where the lady
Yes, I
works
think
for
that
a
this. Yeah,
hairdresser, and he's got a French name, but he's really Jewish, and therefore he's harsh. And it just feels like we're back in the 1920s, which is what I found really disappointing, because it's a very physical anti-Semitism. So anyway, let me find it. So Edward asks Midge, is the woman who runs it pleasant and sympathetic to work for? I should hardly describe her as that. She's a Whitechapel Jewess with dyed hair and a voice like a corncrake. So far you could say, well, it's Midge being anti-Semitic. But then this is Agatha Christie in the third person narrative describing the same shopkeeper. A woman with a thick nose, henna red hair, and a disagreeable voice was arguing with a stout and bewildered customer over some alterations to an evening gown. So it is just the thick nose. It's just, Agatha.
And we've
Really?
already been told that she's Jewish, and we've also when we're in the context of this, we're listening to Edward's internal monologue where he's describing all these what he considers nasty character traits, because they're coming across as very money grubbing and penny pinching, and I'm looking at it, and as I was reading it, I was going, like, there's no reason for this person to be Jewish.
Yeah.
We can make this statement about any shopkeeper, and okay, we can make this a bit comical. The religion or the race element doesn't need to come into it. And actually, these are probably attributes that most successful small business owners have. They do haggle, about the price of something, and if they can make a few extra pennies on a deal, they will do, because every penny makes a pound. So,
but it's even more sharply in contrast in a book which is about people who are very passionate about their careers. So you've got John Christow, Henrietta, and Veronica, who, especially John Christow and Henrietta, are really being admired for being so passionate about their careers. And yet you've got the shopkeeper who's running a successful business, but she's not to be admired because she's money grubbing and she has a thick nose. It's really, I can see why they adopted a lot given when it was written, because it just feels like something out of.
And I would say, like,
it really does. It's horrible.
I would be open to knocking it down a tier just on the basis of this, because I am disappointed, because you do see her having some progressive attitudes, and her being quite the way that she's writing some of her women characters is very interesting. She's challenging them, and you can see how social attitudes are changing and for the better, becoming more positive. And I do get the feeling, like, with her being a very intelligent woman and in the position that she was in, particularly if she's having people explain this to her, like, I'm sure that she's going to have this knowledge at her fingertips. And I almost wonder why sometimes she didn't just make it appeal to a broader base and remove some of these items. And I can only put it down to the fact that she is just reflecting British attitudes at the time. This would have been seen as perfectly acceptable.
So
this would have been a common stereotype that most of her audience would have plugged into.
So this is an absolutely key point, isn't it? Because this is Britain in 1946. We have gone through the Holocaust, but the fact that the Holocaust happened is really just coming to light, right? There's a year ago, or when she was writing this, the concentration camps are liberated. You start seeing those horrific photographs. You start getting the Nuremberg trials. But this is the same Britain that really wasn't overly keen on accepting Jewish immigrants when they were trying to flee from Nazi-occupied Europe. And this, what she is at the height of her popularity. She is selling millions and millions of copies of books, and people reading this are not having the same reaction that we are, at least not on this side of the Atlantic. So this tells you something about the absolute, just kind of like, what's the word? Like anti-Semitism, it's like cockroaches. Like it cannot be defeated. It's always there under the surface, waiting to pop out when you least expect it. And in general, the incidence of anti-Semitism in these books has gone down since the 1920s. But then every now and then, when you think you're over it and you're free and clear, another little needless bit of racism pops up, and you're just like,
it's difficult.
If going through the Holocaust can't get rid of this, then this must have been so, and probably still is, right? So deep rooted in society,
I think so.
That it's still there.
It's difficult to sort of give this the sort of serious, the amount of time it needs to have a serious discussion. But like, I think if I was going to try and summarize it, and why I'm so disappointed, is I think that will always be there, because there's always this element of a society where it feels threatened, and so it picks on minorities to create this sense of otherness, to try and create an internal cohesion to protect itself. I understand that, but like, what I like to see is people who are in these positions of power, rather than leaning into it like demagogues, they actually take a stand, or at least don't lean into it. Because it's unnecessary. Like, all the elements that she's got in this character, they could be like, the shop owner doesn't need to have a thick nose, and she doesn't need to be a Jew. She could just be a Cockney or a Brummie or anybody from England who's just very commercially driven, and we can make that work as a comic element, like Ronnie Barker did in Open All Hours. It's not impossible to do. And I just feel like it's lazy. It's lazy stereotyping, and she was better than that. And that's why it's disappointing, because you don't see her, like, you see her when she can do it well. She doesn't stereotype characters. Like some of the complicated female characters that she's written, they don't have that lazy stereotyping. And that's why it's disappointing, I think. But anyway,
what I'd love to know is, I think part of my defense of Agatha in the 20s and 30s is, yes, she was racist and anti-Semitic in some of her work, but there were people who were way worse, like mass market authors. And, it was a particularly virulent time. And actually, her novels stand up better than most, because it is often a throwaway thing. Like, if you took away that little description of the Jewish shopkeeper, nothing in the book would really change, other than it being improved and far better. But if you take a lot of those other really famous authors of the period, you can't take it out, because it's so woven into the fabric of it. So I always felt that you judged the author by the standard of the time, and she was better than the standard of her time in the 20s and 30s, although still not excusable or forgivable. But by 1946, with this sort of comment, I wonder if she's now worse than the standard of her time. I wonder if actually, if you read a sampling, say the top 10 fiction novels of the year, whether she would come across as very old-fashioned in her racism. And I suspect, I don't know, maybe I'll do some research before the next podcast.
I think she's probably still of the time.
Like bang on the benchmark, basically.
Yeah. I think she probably might even still be progressive in her portrayal of some of the female characters that she's got.
Well, definitely, yeah, on the feminism side.
But sure. I think she's probably still of the time. With
just on the anti-Semitism question, I just really wonder.
I would still say the same, because I don't think maybe the impact of the concentration camps had really hit British audiences in the way that it would in later years. It's almost like you had to wait for like the World at War TV series and things like that for it to, really be thrust into the faces of the British public. So I don't know. It's like I'm not around at the time, so I can only like look back at it. But I certainly think that this was it was lazy. And like, what I think as well is like, we've got parts where she's leaned into racial stereotypes for humor. So she did this in Sad Cyprus, and like I mentioned it back then, with the characterization of the Irish nurse in there. And I didn't find it tremendously offensive. I can understand why some people would, but there's a malice to this this passage describing the thick nose and the money grabbing that I didn't see in Sad Cyprus when she was talking about it. And okay, it was partially belittling and playing up to the sort of like the jokey part about them being storytellers. But this has got real malice to it, where you're describing this person as beneath the people around it because of her commercial attitudes, and it's uncomfortable reading,
Yeah,
So
I agree. Definitely. Well, I think more of this to come, actually. More of this to come in future novels. But as you say, everything pre and post Holocaust you look at with a different eye, because post Holocaust it's kind of like there's no reason, there's no excuse to not know where this leads. And it's extreme.
I mean, I suppose we want to move on to that. I did have a couple of other points that I wanted to talk about. I should have mentioned in social change, but they might come into the progressive and regressive side of things. So
go for it.
Ladies are wearing furs, and that is seen as like a badge of wealth and status, which I'm not sure would be considered the same now, or even if it was, I'm not sure we would be writing about it and it being mentioned. And this is the first mention I think I've ever seen of unmarked police cars. So
really,
we've got the police now tailing some of the suspects in souped-up bangers. Because there's this great passage where Henrietta is saying, I've got this supercharged sports car and I should be able to outrun that banger, but I've not managed to lose it for the last couple of hours, and she's going, and I know that the police have got like these cars. These cars that they fitted with more powerful engines.
Absolutely.
So I thought, that was quite interesting, So talking about Agatha marking the sort of technological changes.
Yeah, they're not jumping on trains hither and thither. It is much more about motoring places.
Yeah.
And the democratization of motoring, for sure. Whereas in The Secret of Chimneys, it was just the sort of the posh, aristocratic, sort of slightly batty daughter of the Earl who would have a car. Now everyone has cars, and the middle classes have cars, and so do the police. Okay, let's go into the adaptations before we get into the spoiler-filled part of this podcast. So Christie adapted the book into a very successful stage play in 1951, but as was typical, took out Hercule Poirot from the narrative, which is interesting, actually, because Agatha Christie tells us in her autobiography that her daughter didn't think she should have dramatized the book because most of the interest is in it's in the way the characters are set up and how they think internally.
Yeah, we get a lot of internal monologues.
Yeah, exactly. So, but nonetheless, it was actually pretty commercially successful. We have a single televisual adaptation, which was the 2004 episode of the David Suchet Hercule Poirot series, shown on ITV in the United Kingdom. And it has an all-star cast, as many of these later ones do. We have the legendary actress Sarah Miles as Lady Lucy Angertel, and she's just brilliant. Megan Dodds as Henrietta Savanake, Jonathan Cake as John Christow, Lisette Anthony as Veronica Clay under a peroxide wig, and wonderful casting of Edward Fox as Gudgeon, who's just so good. And I watched it recently, and I just thought it was absolutely superb. And actually, it's very faithful, even to quoting lines of dialogue. They do change very subtly the ending, but not sort of dramatically in terms of the plot architecture. And they get rid of the character of David Angertel, but a lot of the dialogue's just lifted straight from the novel. And yeah, Sarah Miles and Edward Fox as Lucy and Gudgeon was just joy and a thing of beauty. Have you seen this one?
I have, yeah. I mean, I think I would largely agree with you. I wasn't a big fan of Sarah Miles. I think she's a great actress, but I would have liked to have seen my Lady Angertel as more vociferous, more outspoken, and stealing more scenes. And I think she wasn't bombastic enough in my mind's eye. Lady Angertel was a much more bombastic character, but I thought it was a very good adaptation. They weren't as hot on it on the All About Agatha podcast, and they thought that the Henrietta character should have been more commanding on screen. But I didn't find that myself. I enjoyed it.
She's wonderful. Yeah,
I thought it was good. Yeah. And I thought Edward Fox was very good as Gudgeon. It was great when you saw that scene where they were out for target practice, and you can see Gudgeon knows all about the guns, and then as soon as the police inspector turns up, he's like, Gudgeon, you've handed me an automatic, and you told me it was a revolver, and he's like, "Oh, I don't really know what all these guns are about." Gudgeon, you old fraud, you're lying. We know you're lying.
We've missed a great alternate universe Jason Worcester, haven't we? With Edward Fox.
He's brilliantly written, and like the changes that they've made, I don't think the story suffered from them at all.
No.
There's a bit where Poirot finds the murder weapon. That's changed, and I think it's changed for the better, because I think it actually explains that bit a bit more. Whereas in the book, I didn't quite see it myself, but I saw it straight away when it was presented visually. The David Angatell character, he's superfluous, I think.
Absolutely, agree.
In the book. So, like, it's interesting social commentary, and it gives Lady Angatell a chance for a speech later on, which is quite entertaining, and completely flummoxes her husband, which is great to read, but it's not needed, and I think they've done a really good job with the adaptation. I
agree.
enjoyed it.
I think this is delightful. It's one of the better ones, and I would heartily encourage people to both read the book and watch the adaptation. So we'll leave our spoiler-free discussion there. We hope you've enjoyed it and attempted to read the book if you haven't already. And next time we will be talking about Taken at the Flood, which, if you've been wanting some real commentary on what World War II was like for people living in England and what it was like to come back to a country that was completely changed, then that is the novel for you. It is full of amazing social change and commentary. So we hope you'll tune in next time, and stay tuned after the end credits music for some spoiler-filled discussion. Okay, folks, we're back, and now we're going to be spoiler replete. What to say about this book?
I think you need to get your soapbox now and explain to me why the plotting was so bad, because I thought it was marvellous.
Because there's no plotting. There is literally no plotting. And Hercule Poirot says this again and again in the novel. He says, all the time I'm presented with clues are offered up to me, and I try and investigate them, and then they run into dead ends. There is no actual plotting to follow. The point of the book is there is no plotting. There is no murder mystery.
That was all her being Poirot being deliberately misled? Did you not find that intellectual battle between the Angatells and Poirot interesting in any way at all? You didn't?
No, I found it as frustrating as Poirot, because I read the books for the social interest. I read the books also for the characters. So the characters are phenomenal, but then I also read it to see if I can work out the solution. And I found myself absolutely empathetic with Poirot. He was just getting more and more frustrated. This is not, in fact, a murder mystery. This is a good character-based novel. I think if you treat it as not a murder mystery, then you're fine. I've got a little thing in my notes here which is clues.
And you wouldn't
there are
say
no clues that I've written down. There are no clues.
Yeah, but there are loads of clues. We're given lots. Like, do you not think that, like, there was the element of the double bluff? Where they've given you the murderer and the murder and the setting, and then disproved it. Almost like Towards Zero. Where
no, I think there are no plot mechanics. There are literally no plot mechanics to judge.
Okay, all right. Well, I didn't see that. I mean, I would say.
Should we explain to people what the solution is before we start disagreeing about it violently?
Well, they're in the spoiler section, so they must know.
If anyone's listening and hasn't read the novel,
and it hasn't worked out from what Bina's just said about there being absolutely
basically there is no murder mystery. Hercule Poirot stumbles across a swimming pool where a wife looks like she's shot her husband out of jealousy that he's cheating on her, and that is actually what happened. Everything else in the following 180 odd pages is just faffing about.
Well, I think you're being unfair.
I don't think I'm being unfair. I really don't. I don't think this is a murder mystery. I really don't. I think this is like a book like a Mary Westmacott. I don't think this should literally be in the reread.
So for the subsequent 180 pages, in the words of Russell Crowe, were you not entertained?
It's entertained, but in the way I'd be entertained by a comedy book or a social commentary book or a P.G. Woodhouse, not by a murder mystery.
Okay.
If you said this is like a family drama / P.G. Woodhouse, I'd be like,
I'm not
5 out of 5.
I'm not hearing anything bad in what you're saying. Like, I don't place these whodunits. I don't rank whodunits better than Jeeves and Wooster comedies. You know, for me, just because it's got an
but
element of murder mystery, and it doesn't make it.
No,
better.
but you know, if to quote Terry Gilliam, you know, if you go through the door marked "What's it?" you expect to go through that door. When I pick up a Jeeves and Wooster, I know what I'm getting. When I pick up an Agatha Christie murder mystery with Hercule Poirot in it, I am the drab commercial reader. I want what I was promised. I want it to be what it says on the tin. This is not what it says on the tin.
Well, perhaps because I'm not as tied to this plot mechanics requirement. I found like that I was like Poirot and the poor old inspector. I was being taken down all these dead ends.
And it jumps the shark. I mean, like with Poirot, like when Lucy Hassell's just wandering around with a pistol in her egg basket. She says, "I must have had a reason to pick up the pistol. Damned if I know why." And Poirot's going, "Are you fucking kidding me?" And I'm sitting there as a reader going, "Are you fucking kidding me?" But there is nothing to detect in this novel. It's like a meta novel. It's a novel of Poirot solves the novel by figuring out why there's nothing to detect. And I guess that's a good plot twist.
That is Poirot.
It's boring to read. It's just
how many Poirots have we had where Poirot has figured out the crime not because he's found the evidence, but because he's understood the motivations and because he's understood the psychological motivations of the people involved.
The motivation.
And then after he's found
motivation is weak source. So someone that you're sleeping with, but that you know, I mean, Henrietta is very clear-eyed about John. She knows he's narcissistic and she knows he treats Gerda badly. Gerda kills John. The dying word is Henrietta, which is not to implicate Henrietta, but to say, Henrietta, please take care of Gerda. I'm sorry. Why would an entire family become accomplice to a murder to save some feckless, dumb, literally, person they describe as a dumb cow? I just didn't buy any of it. I didn't buy that Henrietta would have done it. I certainly didn't buy that the rest of the family would start working towards her in this way. Nope, didn't buy it.
You never saw the explanation that we were given in the book where Poirot explains how the family sort of like naturally coalesced around Henrietta to support her in what she was trying to do, and you didn't find that was plausible. You didn't think that the fact that
didn't find it plausible that people would be obsessed. It's like watching EastEnders right now. It's literally at the level of the Christmas episode of EastEnders.
Well, I'm fortunate in that I haven't watched EastEnders in about 25 years, and that was
neither
25
had I until this Christmas episode because my mum
25 years too recently. So I'm not even remotely interested in it.
I didn't buy that Henrietta would have done all of that for poor little Gerda, and I didn't buy that Lucy and everyone else, Lucy who loves Ainswick and propriety and blah blah blah, would have been accomplice to. I totally buy that Gudgeon would do what Lucy wanted.
And he's
the only one I buy.
Gudgeon would do anything that Lucy wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
Lucy,
so I buy that.
and
I
Lucy,
don't buy anything else.
Lucy's already been presented as somebody who is Poirot-esque in her belief of her extrajudicial superiority, and she has put family first, and she will decide to do what is best for the family.
I mean, let us remember that murder is a capital crime at this point.
Yeah, and she's not really bothered about it. She is not. She is almost feudal.
Put it this way: if Lucy had been asked to not even cover up but commit a murder to save Ainswick, I would believe that. But the idea that she is doing this because basically everyone feels sorry for Gerda.
Well, she's not doing it because everybody feels sorry for Gerda. She's doing it because Henrietta has an affection for Gerda and wants to help her out. And
you don't cover up a murder because you have an affection for someone. That's just silly.
Henrietta does, and everybody else falls in behind Henrietta. They're all willing to help because Henrietta has decided this is the best course of action. And I mean, and Lucy is already. There's that great passage where she's talking to her husband, and she explains why she would have killed John Christow to save Ainswick. And she talks you all the way through it. And you're going, oh my God, she's done it. Well, you weren't, but like normal people would be sitting there reading it and going, oh my God, she's done it.
I'm abnormal, apparently. Well, tell us who you side with. Are you Team Bina or are you Team Pat? Because I think that the normal reader will be, great characters, really enjoyed it, fun read, but it was not fun to detect. To me, this is a deeply frustrating novel, ultimately. And I think we should probably agree to disagree, because I don't think we are going to agree on this one. I think it's either do you find it credible, or do you not find it credible that this is where the characters do what they do? If you do find it credible, that initial moment that Henrietta decides to do what she does, then I think you probably do follow it through as you did. And I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I would like to add, in my own defense, defense, I don't believe that novels necessarily have to be credible if they are entertaining, because I have read many novels that are completely credible and not entertaining, and I
But
don't
there is
think
an
they have
internal
any merit.
There is a contradiction though, because there's one thing to be like lightly entertaining. There's another
Well,
thing where
yeah,
people praise this novel and say the characters are really fascinating and make sense.
yeah,
But
but we have a
if the strength of the novel is that the characters are believable and credible and make sense and are fascinating, then what they do has to follow from that sensible characterization, right? They can't
yeah.
just then start doing gonzo
No,
shit.
but what I would say is, like, we are reading works of fiction, and when it comes to this factual credibility, we have a sliding scale. We're on a grey area, and some people will find things far more acceptable than others, and that is subjective. So, like when I was at university, somebody told me a great anecdote about a guy they used to watch westerns with, like the spaghetti westerns, and he couldn't watch them. He found them totally unbelievable because they were supposed to be set in Texas, but the geological formations of the Spanish desert totally they didn't resemble anything around there. So there's no, and he couldn't believe them, and that's fair enough. A geology student is watching something on TV and he doesn't find the setting acceptable because of his geological knowledge.
Okay,
That's
so
fine.
there is something different,
But
right? Like
I don't
can
see
watch.
I don't
I
see
don't.
that.
I don't need the
It's like,
landscape to be the reality, but I need your reality that you as an author have created to be consistent in your book.
well, I don't
So
see the inconsistency in
I'm
here.
not. The inconsistency is I don't think that from the single-minded, career-driven, tenacious character of Henrietta Savernake, who sees very clearly what John Christow is and doesn't really respect it, that she would take so seriously his final word to her. I think, yes, she has enough fondness and pity for Gerda to wear a jumper that looks like hers to make her feel better about it.
And to help her win at bridge.
I think it's a wild leap to go from helping someone win at bridge to covering up from them murdering their husband. A wild leap. And I don't think someone as intelligent, rational, career-minded, and basically self-interested as Henrietta would do that. I really don't. And I think if you look at what Lucy cares about, she cares about Ainswick and she cares about social standing and getting her own way. And I don't think she'd compromise any of that to be
I
in this
don't think
headline scheme.
I don't think she's as bothered about social standing. I think she's somebody who's and the way Agatha's presented her is almost somebody who creates her own society.
Does rather help though when you're married to a knight of the realm, though, doesn't it?
Yeah,
she didn't go and marry just anyone.
As with all Christies, the knight of the realm comes across as a bit of a dunce, and the power behind the throne seems to be the person who's really established the power base. Like, she's the one who's been able to bend all these foreign dignitaries and potentates to her will at dinner parties. Like, she's the commanding presence here. But I think she creates her own reality around her. I think she is portrayed as that powerful a person. And I can understand how you've not bought into it. I think, like, you have identified a lot with Agatha Christie's Bright Young Things. And I think you're probably identifying with the career-driven, passionate Henrietta in this, and maybe just not making that leap of faith, whereas maybe I'm not as closely tied to the Henrietta character, and I just buy into the fact, well, she let her win at a few hands of bridge, and she knitted the same jumper as her to make her feel less bad about herself, and she's quite a compassionate character, Henrietta. Yeah, sure, she's going to cover up the murder.
She's not going to perjure herself for a capital crime.
Yeah, it's not a problem. So, like, maybe I'm just not identifying closely enough with Henrietta.
I really don't think it's about identification. I think it's just what is internally consistent for a character as Christie has presented her. But I think we should agree to disagree, because I don't think. Yeah, I respect your view, and I will readily admit that I am being contrarian and being in the minority, apparently, for the Agatha Christie fans. Please feel free to comment and tell me why I'm wrong on the YouTube comments.
Well, I would take it a step further, because I don't consider myself a massive Agatha Christie fan. I am new to a lot of these books, and maybe I'm not holding her to the same high standards you are. But I think this is a good book. I would put it top tier. And the only reason I would knock it out of top tier is I'm disappointed in the racial stereotyping, and the malice in it. And we covered that in the regressive progressive element.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think that's the only reason I would knock it down. And I did actually think that she had some genuinely brilliant bits of writing. And I think when you get back towards the end, and you realise the description of this statue that Gerda's carved out of wood, this pear wood, like we're told there, like you were saying, that we don't get any clues. And yeah, I don't suppose we do, but we are given big hints, you know. And I did find that was fascinating, the way that this, the way Gerda's fanaticism, her fanatical devotion to her husband has been flipped, you know. And I thought they did that quite well in the adaptation at the end, where she gets a little monologue to explain how her idol has fallen before her eyes because she saw that look in his face when he went off with the other woman. You know, that was fascinating sort of like twist of character, particularly with the way that the statue is described, you know, with this sort of like this blind devotion, and the way that everybody thought it was actually very scary, you know, because it had this fanatical devotion. And you almost see that, you know, like if somebody it can be that fanatical and devoted, and you lose that, you know, just how terrifying it can be. And I did find that, you know,
and it is a theme that's run through a lot of Christie recently. These spouses that are described as being medieval or feudal or fanatical in their love, this unbalanced love. So we see it with Faraday's and Sparkling Cyanide as well. This kind of worshipful love that's very dangerous when it's taken away from someone.
Yes, and also these like what I was saying in the sort of the intro section, where I was saying that this theme of still water running deep. Like we see this in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, where Alfred Lee Poirot goes, like Alfred Lee is one of the characters who commit the murder because psychologically he has repressed his emotions. You know, he has subjugated himself to the will of his father, and when something goes wrong, you know, he will explode, and all that passion will come out because it's still there. And again, we see it in like Five Little Pigs with Caroline Crail, where she's somebody who actually visibly expresses this anger and frustration rather than bottling it up, because she sees it as a release, and she knows she's dangerous if she doesn't find a release for it. You know, so like this is a theme that Christie has running through her books. I think it's one of the more interesting aspects of Christie's that I've been reading.
I agree.
You know,
I agree, and I do like. I think Gerda I find almost the most credible character, if not the most interesting to read. I do think it to me that was profoundly believable that she would act as she'd done. All right, well, let's draw it to a close. We've done over an hour and a half, which is a record. I mean, I didn't think we were going to go so long, but this is the first one we properly, seriously disagreed on, I think, which is quite fun.
It's a shame that you wouldn't accept that I was right. I've got one more comment I want to make, and it's because we are so far into the Christies, but she is beginning to run out of names, because we have got Ridgway's disease here, and the inquest is held at the village of Depleach, and he was also the unsuccessful counsel in 2 previous books.
But is she running out of names, or is this just her giving little Easter eggs to readers?
Well, are we going to agree to disagree on this?
I think so.
Okay. Well, let us continue the battle in our next podcast, and we'll see if she's recycling names again. So,
indeed. All right. Well, join us next time, reader, when hopefully Pat and I will come together again in complete agreement on the greatness of Agatha. This is definitely one that I love the character. I completely get why people love this book. For me, it is definitely mid-tier because it's not actually a mystery. Or maybe it's like it's the sort of the book after which the league table. It's like the honorary hollow Agatha Christie league table, and then everything else gets ranked, because I think it's just so different. But anyway, we will leave it there.
Brilliant.
Join us next time for Taken at the Flood, which may be a mini pod, it may be a full pod. And we're building up to Crooked House, which I think is one of the all-time greats. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that one too.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have Hannah for that as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to literally flip and fly to Los Angeles and make sure that we record with you. Like, I'm going to make sure this happens with Hannah, because we need her insights on this one. And we wish you all, vassals, listeners of VOC, a wonderful new year. All the best for everything you want to achieve and experience in 2024. We hope you have a very good and healthy one to you and yours. So, thank you for listening.
If they've made it to the end of this podcast, yes, thank you for your patience.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Pat, and have a great new year.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bina. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
By the way, have you watched Murder is Easy?
No, I'm saving it. I've noticed they've had a bit of sort of an Agatha Christie-a-thon on BBC, haven't they? So we had Evil Under the Sun, that played, and Lucy Worsley did her Agatha Christie
Yes.
show. And yeah, we've got The Murder Is Easy. So there's a few bits and pieces that I would like to catch up on. I watched like about an hour, but sort of like the last hour of Evil Under the Sun.
Excellent.
Yeah, just to refresh. I was pottering around doing some bits and pieces, and it was on the TV, so I could easily have it on in the background. I want to give Murder Is Easy a fair crack of the whip.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I really, for what it's worth, without spoiling anything, I would say I really enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Yeah,
well, I think it's got the bones of a good story. Like you didn't enjoy it that much, but I almost enjoyed the sort of the reveal at the end. Where the psychopath goes into it, because I like, you shouldn't laugh, but I almost found it comical. Because like the body count was massive, when she's talking through like who she's killed, you're like, oh my god.
No, I think it's really well done, and I think where they update things and I think it's just done in a really intelligent way. The other one we watched today was because in part of this BBC run, they showed the Billy Wilder version of Witness at the prosecution. Witness for the prosecution.
Yeah, Witness for the prosecution. Yeah,
which I've never seen as a play, so I didn't know the twists, and it really holds up. Got Marlene Dietrich in it. It's just amazing. Yeah, it was really good. So we watched that this afternoon. Really enjoyed it. I got the first twist, did not get the second, or really well done. Have to say.
You amateur, Bina. Unbelievable.
I know.
Imagine not getting the Agatha Christie twist before the end.
The funny thing is my husband's now really starting to get them, because he's just unfortunately having to be in the room when I'm watching a lot of these old Poirots and things. So for a non-Christie fan, he's now very Christie attuned. It's hilarious. So he got more of this one than I did. Like he was very, very fast out the gates.
Well, he's seen too many when he's starting to spoil them for you. When he's
watching Murder
after the first hour going, this is how this is going to work out. And you're like,
it's like, did we watch this one before? It's like, about 2 months ago over breakfast coffee, I was like watching a bit of the end of Murder Is Easy. It's like, yeah, I remember this. I was like, oh my God, poor guy.